upcoming June. I know I don't look that old. We have 3 grown children, all out of the house, praise God. And we have 3 grandchildren with 1 on the way. So being a grandparent is great. You get to do all the fun things with the children. You get to spoil them, and then they go home. And it's the best part of it all. So anyway, we've been parishioners at St. Louis for almost 34 years. Since we moved to Howard County back in 1990, we visited several churches in the area. But when we came to St. Louis, we felt very much that the Spirit was alive at St. Louis. And I feel the same thing here at St. Francis. It was welcoming, a lot of activities going on. You can find somewhere to fit in at St. Louis, St. Francis. So hopefully you'll be able to continue to participate in this great community. My wife and I coordinate marriage prep. I'll talk a little bit about that tonight. My hope is that this discussion will be interactive. So if a question occurs to you, please feel free to ask. Right? And then I'll probably be asking some questions as well. And my hope is that they're not all rhetorical questions. You get my drift. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 3 things this evening. First is what is marriage as defined by the Catholic Church versus what is marriage as reflected in today's society. Right? First. Secondly, I'd like to talk about the marriage rite itself, because the rite, R-I-T-E, the rite of marriage explains a lot about what the actual sacrament of marriage is all about. And then the third thing is, how do you prepare for marriage, right? Now, some of you are already married. Sorry, it's too late. But but for those that aren't, but you might be interested, and I think it's important to understand what we mean when we talk about our sacraments, not just marriage, but baptism, all of them, so that we're informed, right? We've heard the concept of apologetics. It's a defending of the faith. And as Catholics, I believe we have an obligation to do that. In order to do that, you have to know it. Okay? All right, so first thing, marriage in today's society. Marriage for millennia has been the foundation, the building block of society. All right? We believe as Catholics, I think as Christians, that marriage was created by God. How do we know that? Well, because he created us, man and woman, and said, I want you to go forth and multiply. We hear in Genesis, then God said, let us make human beings in our image after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, the tame animals, all the wild animals, and all the creatures that crawl on the earth. God created mankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, be fertile and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it. God looked at everything he had made and found it very good. For generations, right, that has been the basis for marriage, that God created us, man and woman, to be together in sacramental marriage. In the Catechism of the Catholic Church, this will be the only time I quote it, man and woman were made for each other. Not that God left them half-made and incomplete. He created them to be a communion of persons in which each can be helpmate to the other, for they are equal as persons, bone of my bone. And they are complementary. They're not the same, but they complement one another as masculine and feminine. In marriage, God unites them in such a way that by forming one flesh, they can transmit human life. They can be fertile and multiply. By transmitting human life to their descendants, man and woman as spouses and parents, and this is the part I love, cooperate in a unique way in the Creator's work. The love between a man and a woman in sacramental marriage is the same love it reflects the same love that God has for us, right? God loves us no matter what we do. Have you talked about reconciliation yet? All right, he loves us. There's nothing we can do where God will stop loving us. It's unconditional. And he created us so that marriage reflects that same thing. It's unconditional. It's actually part of the right that you profess that love unconditionally. If the marriage reflects that unconditional love, then the two truly become one flesh, just as God tells us. And then the beauty of that is the result of that union is what? It's life, right? It's the ability to pass that love on to others, to your children, and to your children's children. That's the meaning of that unconditional love within marriage. In Matthew's gospel, we hear that some Pharisees were testing Jesus by saying, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause whatsoever?" And Jesus said to them, "Have you not read that from the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, 'For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two become one flesh.' So they are no longer two, but one flesh." And then he tells them, "Therefore what God has joined together, no human being must separate." Marital love models Trinitarian love. There's one model of the Trinity that says the Father loves the Son loves the Father, and it's the Holy Spirit that represents that love. Okay? And so the thing that holds the Trinity together is the love the Father and the Son have for one another through the Holy Spirit. Our marriages should reflect that. All right? Now, it's a lot easier to talk about it theoretically and talk about modeling between the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. But we have to pursue some model. And that model should be one of perfection, because the Father and the Son are perfect. Okay? Now, I have to be completely honest. I hate when people say that, because that means they've been lying to you the whole time. But, I've never understood that. I got married, my wife and I were married in our mid-20s, and I can still remember, and I use this in my homilies at weddings, I can still remember being at church and thinking, what am I doing here? I don't understand this, okay? But I did it anyway, and thank God, praise God that I did. And then my wife, I think we had our first child within 2 years of marriage, and then another one, and then another one. And I came to realize and to understand the unconditional love as part of a marriage was the love that I had for my children. My children cannot do anything that would cause me to not love them unconditionally. Now, they've pissed me off a few times, right? But I still love them, and there's nothing that they can do to make me stop loving them. That is, to me, and I've come to realize that through the lens of life and the wisdom that comes from that, is that represents marital love, which then represents what? The love that the Father has for us, the love that God has for us. There's nothing we can do that can separate us from that love. Okay? All right. But, so we have that definition of marriage based on millennia of teachings of the church and revelation from God. And then we have today's society, right? Why is there so much confusion today about what marriage is? There's your first case of a non-rhetorical question. Why do you think that is? Conditional. Conditional love. Who decides? We do, right? So we've gone from understanding marriage to be created by God to something that man has created, humans have created. And if God created marriage, then it's been revealed by God and cannot be changed. We can't redefine it. And yet, if we've created it, then we can do what? We can redefine it as to whatever we want it to be. And that's kind of where the confusion comes today. We want marriage to be whatever we want it to be because that's inwardly focused and we win. Right? We get the benefit of that versus it being unconditional, sacrificial love, representing the love God has for us. Jesus did not negotiate with us before he got up on that cross. He didn't say, if you do this, then I'll do that. He just did that. Why? Because the love he has for us is unconditional. And that's the type of love that should be reflected in marriage. All right? I think a lot about this because it's changed so quickly about what marriage is in society. I read a very good article that compared and contrasted Christian Catholic marriage with a marriage in secular society. And if you look at a Catholic Christian marriage, the husband and wife are equals. They have equal value in that relationship, right? But that doesn't mean they're the same. Because man and women are not the same. We are different in nature, right? We have different temperaments. We have different physical attributes. Okay, I cannot have children. I don't care what anybody says, I can't have children, right? That doesn't diminish me. It doesn't make me better. It's just who it's nature has defined me. God created me that way, right? And he's created male and females to be complementary, right? We have a complementary purpose, right? And all of that has been defined, has been revealed by divinity. It's a divine revelation, right? Versus the way the secular world tries to define marriage, it's not the husband and wife aren't equal. It's that it's all about me, right? It's all about the individual. It's an inwardly focused type of relationship. And it's trying to say that the male and the female are the same. It's a unisex relationship. That can't be possible, right? It's the way the world is trying to define it. Why? I think to destroy it, right? They're trying to destroy the family as God has intended it, right? And so we as Catholic, that's why it's so important that we try to get our children married in the church so that they can have a focus on what marriage is from a divinely revealed perspective. Does that make sense? Okay. Questions about that? Don't let the world define what it is. Right? You should look to God for an understanding of what marriage is. Okay, I'd like to shift now to talk about the marriage rite. Because the marriage rite, the way it's set up, helps emphasize what I just talked about, what Catholic marriage is. So the marriage of a man and a woman in the Catholic Church is intentionally meant to be a public event, right? You invite the community into the marriage rite, all right? The couple, there's actually 3 parties to a marriage. There has to be, right? The first is the couple. They are actually the ministers of the sacrament. It's the only sacrament where they minister. It's not like in baptism where the priest or the deacon is the minister of the sacrament. In marriage, the couple actually are the ministers. They're the one party. The second party is the clergy, either a priest or a deacon, who witnesses the marriage for the church. And then the third, equally important party is the community. Right? The couple is going to make public vows. They're going to publicly acclaim and affirm 3 things in the wedding ceremony. And those three things are, well, let me read you the questions as from the right, and then we'll talk about what they mean. So, right before they actually exchange vows, which we've all heard, I, Joe, take you, Sarah, to be my wife. You've all heard that. Well, there's three questions before that consent. And the priest or deacon will say this, Joe and Sarah, I made that up. Joe and Sarah, have you come here to enter into marriage without coercion, freely and wholeheartedly? And both the male and the female, the man and the woman, have to answer in the affirmative, or you're done. Right? You can't go on. And they don't say we have, because they're not married yet. They have to answer as an individual. And so together they have to say, I have come here to enter into marriage without coercion, freely and wholeheartedly. Right? Number one. Secondly, are you prepared as you follow the path of marriage to love and honor each other as long as you both shall live? And they both have to affirm, I am. And I make sure they do it loudly so the witnesses can hear it. And then the third is, are you prepared to accept children lovingly from God and to bring them up according to the law of Christ and his church? And again, they answer in the affirmative, I am. All right? So what's the significance of those three things? Well, first one was, have you come here without coercion, freely and wholeheartedly? Well, what does that represent? Free will, unconditional. So if you say, look, if you pay off your student debts, Sue, I'll marry you. Well, that's a condition. You've placed a condition on and it can make it invalid. Okay? Or if the groom was drinking with his buddies the morning of, I had a couple, the guys brought beer into the church. Right? That can invalidate the marriage because they may not be able to unconditionally assert that they're wholeheartedly without coercion, etc. Does that make sense? So that's the first thing is unconditional love. Right? Second, if the love is unconditional, can it be undone? No, because then that's a condition, right? That you can undo it. And so the second one is that the marriage is the affirmation is the understanding that it is for life. All right. That's why after the exchange of the vows, the priest or the deacon says, "What God has joined, let no human being separate." It's actually part of the rite. And then the third thing is, if marriage reflects the divine, if it's unconditional, wholehearted, without coercion, then because God created us in a complementary way, then as part of that rite, as part of that joining, that union, we get to participate in his miracle of life, right? And so in order for it to be unconditional, if you say, I want to get married, but I don't want to have children, is that unconditional? No, you place a condition, right? And so as a result, that's why the church doesn't accept artificial contraceptive, because that's a condition on the conjugal act, right? You're placing a condition and you're not supposed to, right? Now, so every conjugal act should be open to being a participant in creating life. That's why the church teaches against artificial contraception and for natural family planning, which I'll talk about in a minute, okay? So those are the three. So after the homily, that's the first thing that happens is the couple have to affirm those three things. Unconditional, for life, open to children. Now, for pastoral reasons, if the couple is like 65, they don't have to be open to children. They probably can't be open to children, right? And so for pastoral reasons, you can drop that. But I've had couples say, they were in their mid-20s, and when I ask them as I prepare them for marriage, are you open to children? And they say no. You have to stop and then say, okay, well, let's talk about that. Why is that? One person was on medicine, a very peculiar medicine that if she stopped taking it, there would be some adverse effects, but it was also didn't allow her to get pregnant. Okay, we can talk about that. They're open to adoption, because we talked about that. They just can't physically have children, right? Versus someone that says, well, we just don't want children. So why you have to pursue that and get an understanding, because that layers on a condition that goes against the Catholic understanding of what marriage is. Okay? Make sense? Then you have the exchange of vows. That's where they say, I, Sue, take you, Joe, to be my husband, to love, to honor, until death do us part. You've all heard that part. And then the rite goes on as normal. If it's a nuptial marriage, you can have a Eucharist, but that's not required. So, for example, if a deacon is a minister of the sacrament, then obviously there wouldn't be Mass. Okay? Any questions about the marriage rite?
Well, I just want, sorry. That's the intent, right? Because you do have those unconditional way of doing, commitments.
Yeah.
But that's the intent because of all the different case scenario you mentioned.
So what is your question?
So my question is, when you get involved, you may have the intent to have kids,
yes,
not to divorce, and so on. But because of the circumstances, you ended up not being able.
And I'm going to talk about the annulment process briefly, and Deacon Franken's very, very knowledgeable about that. The understanding going in, right, is that those three things are present, right? That you understand as a couple that you're coming into this unconditionally and for life and open to having children. Now, if later on there's a divorce, that means there's something. There's a couple ways to look at it, but one of the reasons is that there was a lack of understanding of what it truly meant to be unconditional, right? That you answered in the affirmative, that you thought you understood what it was, but then later down the road, 10 years from now, you say, well, wait, there's an indication that there wasn't a full understanding of what that meant. Love in a marriage is a choice we make. It's not a feeling. It's not I'm happy, I'm sad, because if that were the case, I know, there would be times you would fall out of love because you're not happy. But marriage is from a Catholic point of view it's a choice we make to enter into that relationship. Now I understand life is complicated. Life gets messy, right? And that's why we have this annulment process. Maybe we just talk about it now. That allows us to look at the circumstances in the marriage that maybe indicate there was a lack of understanding of what those things meant. Does that make sense?
I disagree, but
okay.
Because you mentioned that it's a lack of understanding, but I'm not talking about the fact that you did not understand. I'm talking about the case scenario that you've been dealing with, and you ended up in a situation where you just cannot keep going.
And that's why we have the annulment process is what caused the breakdown in the relationship? And I don't want to get into it. But what you're trying to get to is what caused the breakdown, and is there an indicator in that indicates there was a lack of understanding? If the answer is no, then you don't get the annulment. And you can get a divorce. A divorce is a civil process, right? It's just not recognized by the church. You're still married in the eyes of the church. And a marriage is considered valid until there's circumstances that prove that it's not, right? And so invalidity of a marriage would be that one of those three things was not fully understood. Now there's other things such as lack of canonical form. So if I were to get married, I'm Catholic, right? I'm baptized Catholic. My wife was Catholic, but we chose to get married on the beach, in Bethany, right? By some minister. Then I did not ask for permission to do that from the church. So that our marriage would not be valid in the eyes of the church. It would be considered a lack of canonical form. We didn't get permission to do that. Does that make sense? And so that would be grounds for getting an annulment if I ever needed to get an annulment from my wife, because we didn't follow canonical form. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but the basis of the marriage is those three things.
You said I am. I thought it was I do.
You say I do to, will you, Joe, take you? I do. But for these, it says, have you come? I have come. Are you prepared? I am. And are you prepared? I am. And then when you exchange the vows, it's I do.
So are you saying in the eyes of the Catholic Church, if you don't agree to have children, it's not seen as a valid marriage?
If you say, I don't want children, then you can't get married in the Catholic Church. Now, when I've encountered that, I've always pursued it and said, okay, let's talk about that. What's the reason? And in the two cases that I've encountered it, it wasn't that they didn't want children. It's that the one had a medical reason they couldn't, and the other was, let's say, yeah, if we have children, we're fine with that, but we don't want them now. And I'm like, okay, well, what about in 5 years? And so when I explained what it meant, they were saying, oh, sure, yeah, we want kids.
But if you get to the end of that and it's just not something that the couple sees for themselves, and they still want to get married in the Catholic Church, technically it's not a valid marriage.
If you cannot answer affirmatively to, are you prepared to accept children lovingly from God and to bring them up according to the church? Now, it shouldn't get to the wedding ceremony. I mean, I would know that 6 months in advance, right? Because we would talk about that. But technically, no, you can't. Because then you're placing a condition which goes against the church's teaching of the understanding of marital love. Okay. Okay. Well, we've talked about that. We talked about the indissolubility of marriage. We talked about, so annulments mean that there was a circumstance within the relationship that those three things were not understood, were not pursued, were not lived. Okay? And then I also talked about the other thing was the lack of canonical form. As I said, you didn't, like, if a Catholic is marrying a non-Catholic, is that allowed in the Catholic Church? Sure, you just have to get permission to do that. I can't grant that. The only person that can grant that is the ordinary, who is the bishop, right? And so you have to apply for a dispensation to marry a non-Catholic. It's not that we're saying you can't, you just have to get permission to do that. If you don't get permission and you get married, it's not valid, okay? Now, as I mentioned, Deacon Frank is very involved in the tribunal, the marriage tribunal for the Archdiocese. And you may have talked about this. So if you have questions about that, please, I would suggest you can ask me and you can ask Deacon Frank as well. Okay? Okay. Last thing I want to talk about is marriage prep. We've talked a lot about what the first step is, and that's meeting with the member of the clergy who is going to officiate at your wedding. And they will do what's known as a prenuptial interview. And the purpose of that is to get to whether there are any impediments to you getting married in the Catholic Church, right? And an impediment, for example, for me would be, I've been ordained a deacon, same thing with Deacon Frank. If my wife predeceases me, then a vow of celibacy automatically kicks in and I cannot get remarried, right? And so if I attempted to contract marriage, that would be an impediment and it would be invalid. I couldn't get married in the Catholic Church. Now, you can get permission from Rome. It has to come from Rome. But for people my age, they don't grant that. They only grant that for people that are, like, they're deacons whose wife dies and they're 40 years old, they have young kids, and it's for the welfare of the family. But, my kids are in their 30s. Ain't happening, all right? The other purpose of that interview is to understand whether the couple understands those three things, unconditional, for life, and children, and are they able to live that way, right? Now, again, the attempt of that is to make sure the couple understands what they're doing, and so that when they get up there and they say, I am, I have, I am, they understand what they are affirming, okay? Now, again, I'm guessing that the first thing in an annulment process they look at is that form to make sure it's correctly filled out, okay? So that's the first thing. Every couple is required to participate in pre-Cana. You can't get a driver's license, right? I want to drive today, so I'm going to go get a driver's license. What do you have to do? You have to prepare for that. You have to take class, driver's test, et cetera, et cetera. So we believe it's a little more important than getting a driver's license to get married. And so it should be at least 6 months in advance that you're contacting your parish, and that the parish is going to require you to participate in a pre-Cana session. Here at St. Louis and St. Francis, we now have it's a 2-day event. It starts on Friday night with supper and a few talks. It's an opportunity. We're finding that the couples enjoy the fellowship and getting to know one another, getting to know other people that are in their same circumstance, typically the same age. They're just getting married, and they have an opportunity to get to know one another and ask questions. The next day is another full-day session, and it ends with Mass either here or at St. Louis, depending on where we're doing it. Some of the topics we talk about is communication. Rob and Kelly, they present that at our pre-Cana. It's important that couples communicate, right, effectively. What does that mean? How do you resolve conflict? There will be conflict. And so how do we resolve that? What does it mean to have a spiritual marriage? Okay? And what does it mean to have intimacy in your marriage? As soon as you say the word intimacy, the first thing that pops into people's head is the physical aspect of it. And I'm a 64-year-old man who's a deacon. What am I going to explain about physical intimacy to anybody, right? But I can talk about spiritual intimacy. And spiritual intimacy is actually a leading indicator to physical intimacy. If a couple shares spiritual intimacy, they will share physical intimacy, okay, in marriage. And so it's more important to me that couples understand what does that mean to be spiritually intimate with one another. Can you reveal the true you to your spouse? And if you think about that, there's not a whole lot of people that do that. That they reveal, they have no fear in revealing their true self to their spouse. That is spiritual intimacy, is being able to do that. And then we also talk about financing. I've heard studies say that the biggest issue in divorce is not communication, it's not intimacy, it's finances. Right? And so we're not going to solve anything in these conferences, but what we try to do is say, hey, have you thought about it? Have you talked about it? Whose family traditions are you going to adopt? That can cause conflict. And how are you going to resolve that? Okay, so we talk a lot about that. There's also an inventory, it's called Focus, that we use, where the couple independently answer about 150 questions about all kinds of different topics: intimacy, spirituality, finances, family tradition. And then what the system does is it compares the man's response to the woman's response to see if they're in agreement. And then it compares that to what the church teaches, right? So one of the questions, I always use this as an example, is, have you talked about pets? Well, frankly, I don't care, right? Because that isn't going to make or break anything. But what it does tell me is, have they really thought about everything, right? Have they considered all aspects of marital life? And then just to reveal, the church really has no teaching on that. They don't care whether they have pets, right? But they will talk about things like, are you, and it asks both this, are you concerned that your spouse's career will interfere with family life? Well, that's a significant issue. And the answer should be no, we're not concerned. And if that is the case, that means you've talked about it. All right? And then the church reveals that, yes, you should not be concerned. And so again, there's the couple, and then there's the church. And it's like a triangle, and you hope they're all in agreement. Okay? Because you could have the couple agree, but it goes against the teachings of the church. That's a problem. Okay? Does that make sense? And so it's a pretty, it's not a test. You can't fail it. But it's a great discussion point. And in fact, they don't even want you to give them a copy. So you just give them a copy to look at, and then when you're done discussing, you take it back. Because you don't want it to be the hammer. Right? You said, because that's not the point of it. It's to open up conversation. Right? I mentioned the dispensations, the permissions. You need a dispensation to marry a non-Catholic. You need a dispensation to marry a non-baptized person. Right? Can you get married outside a church? In the Archdiocese of Baltimore, you can, but you have to get permission. Right? They don't want you getting married at a bowling alley. It has to be at a venue, right? And so you have to apply for it, and then the church, the chancery, approves it. All right, I have several this year. All right, and then there's also and I'm sure Deacon Frank's probably talked about this, a convalidation. If you did get married outside the church wants to validate your marriage. They want to bring you into the church, and so there's a process called convalidation, where a couple who's married legally, maybe, and we saw a lot of this during the pandemic, couples, they had already planned to get married. They needed to get married for a variety of reasons. Some were in the military, etc. So they civilly got married. Well, that's not recognized in the church. It's not valid, right, until you get married sacramentally in the church. They recognize the civil marriage, but it's not a valid marriage. Does that make sense? All right. And so it looks very similar to a regular wedding. In fact, most of the words are the same. All right. So that's kind of what we go through for marriage prep. Any other questions that you might have about marriage in the Catholic Church?
Why would the church consider giving permission for somebody to marry an unbaptized person outside the church?
They say for the spiritual benefit of the family, in the hopes that the non-baptized person will be baptized, that they will be brought into the church. So that's what they say. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
Who is they?
The church teaching. So we have the Catechism of the Catholic, the CCC. I don't know. Have you all talked about that? Okay. It's the teachings of the church, the magisterium. Okay. And so if you look at the dispensation form, it actually says on there for the spiritual benefit of the family. I mean, wouldn't you want that? If a Catholic baptized person is marrying a non-baptized, you would hope that their marriage would somehow draw the other person into the church. That's a lot of the reasons why the church allows marriages outside a church building, is that for a lot of Catholics marrying non-Catholics in hopes of bringing not only the other person, but family and friends as well. And I've talked to couples about that, and that's what they said their intent was. Their hope was that it would, through their witness, bring other people into the church.
So when a Catholic marries a non-Catholic, is the service can only be performed by a deacon, not a priest?
A priest, yeah, sure. I mean, it's the challenge with that is if it's like having a mass.
Right.
Yeah. So the challenge with that is if there's a non-Catholic, that means there's a lot of non-Catholics that are at the ceremony. And so that means half the congregation can't receive the rite. But you can do it. I've seen it done. Yeah. But you just have to take that consideration. Yeah. Does that make sense?
So according to the Catholic Church, all the civilian weddings, as long as they don't fulfill those three conditions,
well, they may be. They just because they're a civilian marriage, they may still be living those things, and that's a perfect example of a couple you would want to validate their marriage because they're living that. Does that make sense? And so you'd want to bring them in to make it sacramental. We believe through. I mean, what is a sacrament? Not just marriage, but they're all. It's an outward sign of what? Grace. So through the sacraments, we receive grace. So wouldn't you want your marriage to be grace-filled? And so the way you can do that is to bring it into the church. And so I would encourage. I mean, the church considers. So if you got married in the Methodist Church, that's considered a valid. We look at that as a valid marriage. We just want you, if you're going to be Catholic, to bring that marriage into the Catholic Church to validate it. Does that make sense?
I have a question. So is that for all countries?
Oh yeah.
So my daughter got married in France, the Catholic Church,
Mm-hmm.
and she's not Catholic.
But is her
husband's Catholic, but she wasn't, and all she had to do is show her.
baptismal certificate?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Well, it's the so where were they living?
in Miami. But
So
that checks out.
it's taken 2,000 years to come up with the system. And so what happens is the diocese in which you're domiciled, meaning the diocese where you live, has jurisdiction. So they should have gotten permission from Miami to get married in France.
Oh, they got married in Miami and then they went to France. So that's the count, right?
Wait a minute. I'm confused now. It all matters where they were living.
No, she.
Just ask her.
Yeah.
They did a civil ceremony
Okay.
in Miami,
Okay.
and then they went to France
You got married in
and
the Catholic
got
Church.
married in a Catholic church.
Right. So, but they were living in Miami.
Right.
So Miami has to give them permission to do that. But I'm sure the church in France, they should have gone through that process.
But it's confusing because you want to bring them within the Catholic Church. So now.
Well, they're already in the Catholic Church. They got married in the Catholic Church.
Yeah, but
The issue is, I've done weddings in Virginia. I'm in Baltimore, and the couple lived in D.C. You have to get, so I had to send all my paperwork to Baltimore. Baltimore sends it to D.C. to grant permission because they lived in D.C. And then they sent the paperwork to Virginia, and then they granted me delegation to do the wedding. We think the federal government. You almost need a lawyer, a canon lawyer, just to figure out paperwork. So, welcome.
So if a couple got married outside of the church, if they were Christians and they got married in another church, maybe they didn't completely understand Catholic Church's teachings, like for instance about being open to children.
Mhm.
They weren't when they got married. If the church gave them an annulment on those grounds, then I don't understand why the church would do that, because they still made promises. They made commitments to each other. Don't those hold weight just as their word making promises?
So part of the annulment process is to understand exactly that. What did they understand? And technically, I can't speak to it because I'm not part of that process. Deacon Frank would be able to. Like, what do they look at to get an understanding of whether the couple could understand it or not?
But even if they didn't, doesn't the fact that they made promises to each other matter at all?
Well, you're assuming that they were able to, that they had they were competent to make those commitments. Maybe they weren't. Right? I know couples that got divorced because there were psychological issues that didn't reveal themselves until later in the relationship. Well, if that was the case, you question whether they were able. And again, I'm not a canon lawyer; I'm an accountant, right? So I don't know the technicalities of it. But to me, if there's a psychological issue that's revealed itself later in the relationship, that could have an effect on their ability to understand and live by those commitments. Does that make sense? And that's what they have to find out. They actually, if you want an annulment, they're going to talk to your ex-spouse to find out what they think. Now if the ex-spouse refuses to, then you don't need their testimony. But the attempt is to understand exactly that. So, were they able? What was the situation? Okay. Maybe they had a substance abuse issue, right? And that clouded their ability or diminished their ability to fully understand what it meant to make that commitment. Maybe they were 15. That's why we don't allow, children, because they can't understand exactly what it means. Does that make sense?
what's the legal age?
Uh,
Or the Catholic.
well, I can only tell
legal
you.
Catholic age.
So if the couple is under 21 years of age, the parents have to give permission. So, which is interesting because I think that you can vote at 18, right? You can go to war at 18, but you can't get married. But that's one of the questions you have to ask. How old you are.
But having the parents giving the permission, they are not the one committing.
I know. So then you can question whether is can an 18-year-old have the maturity to understand what it means to come in unconditionally for life and be open to children? Can they understand that? Do they have the maturity? I don't think I did, but I didn't get married at 18. Right? I wonder, when I was 24, what did I understand? But I still got married, and I'm still married 4 years later. Okay? Hopefully that was helpful. I know I didn't answer everybody's question. I'd be happy to stick around and answer or talk to anybody if they have any other questions. Thank you.